If you're being paid for consulting, you should always answer, I need more information. But you should also answer it for this question, because this is actually the subject of a great set of JavaScript pitfalls that, on the one hand, we know that the browser has become this important part of the client stack. It's essentially the client OS. And because you can do really complicated things with CSS and rendering has become more complicated, there's a good deal of performance costs associated with doing this. But despite that, there's a huge pitfall in just assuming that if your app is sluggish, adding JavaScript will make the app more responsive. There's a number of ways that this strategy can go wrong if you don't first measure where the sluggishness is coming from. And after spring break, when we start talking about performance, we'll show you some tools that help you do that. So one risk, and I've actually seen this happen in some projects, is when you're doing a lot of data manipulation on the client in order to figure out what to render, compared to doing that same thing on the server, when you do a non-AJAX interaction, the server is doing a very targeted thing to produce a very specific view or a specific partial. But if you're consuming most of your data in the front end and then using it to do different things, you end up having to send more data to the front end. And that means that your database queries get wider. So they actually can get more expensive. So in some sense, you're moving work away from the place where you have a tight scope around what that work is. You're moving the work to the front end, but now, so that the front end has more liberty to be decoupled from what the controller actions are doing. But one cost of doing that is you actually now have to send more data back to the client because you're not 100% sure which of the client behaviors is going to depend on it. Also, you are, in fact, at the mercy of the JavaScript interpreter on a wide variety of devices. There's a great clip that's embedded in the MOOC. It's called, it's in the SAS TV series. And it's an interview with one of the principal engineers at Twitter who did a big overhaul, moving Twitter from being largely server-side to being very Ajaxian client-side. And kind of they moved the world to JavaScript. And they actually ran into a lot of problems with that for this exact reason. They have a worldwide user base. And a lot of their users were on older browsers or on JavaScript interpreters that hadn't been as well optimized. Or they had a lot of extensions loaded. Browser extensions in a lot of browsers rely heavily on JavaScript as part of how they work. So they get into the performance path. So there's a number of factors that as a developer you lose control over when you decide to move some things into the domain of the JavaScript interpreter. It's also true, and if you've already tried starting to write your JavaScript tests for your projects, that testing and debugging JavaScript, although it's better than it used to be, is still a good deal harder. The tools are just not quite as mature. There's many more moving parts in terms of where something can go wrong, because you now have to handle client-side errors as well in a graceful way. So even if there is a benefit in terms of performance, you often will buy it at the cost of code that's more complicated to test and maintain. And was there a question before I went on from that?
What extra data do you need on the client side? Are you sending it still to the Active Directory when you're sending information to JavaScript?
Are you talking about the too wide API to server? Why is that a problem? So it depends a lot on how you structure the client-side part of the app. If the client-side part is very granular and you've got little self-contained panels or widgets, and each one is only doing a very targeted request against the server, you're probably OK. But I've seen apps where there's essentially it's a single-page app. It's all one thing. And there's really only one request to the server, which is give me back a whole bunch of data, and then I'm going to parse the data and format it in different ways. So you've essentially moved some of the formatting and filtering work away from the server and onto the client, which means that now you have to send more data to the client, some of which is not going to be used, and the client has to spend more time crunching it. So this is not necessarily something that will occur, but it can occur if you're not careful about how you scope the different pieces of your client app.